So it could be important in one of two ways. One way is people are poor, their cognitive resources are constrained, and that has bad effects for them in a sense that it makes their poverty. It means that poor people also suffer from making bad choices because they're poor and their cognitive resources are constrained. The alternative version of this is that it's actually contributing to their poverty. That because that in a sense there's a poverty trap. They're poor, so they make bad choices, which means they stay poor. Is it the bad effects of poor choices on the poor that's worrying you, or is it the thought that this is actually a cause of their poverty, and that if we've finally identified the constraint, that if we could relax it, would enable people to lift themselves out of poverty? That the problem is cognitive scarcity, and we can relax that constraint, and then that gets them on the virtuous path. Which of these two views, or is it both that you're? Yeah,
I would say it's a bit of both. I mean, I'm not sure we have the evidence to suggest there's a real trap, but we do think that when you provide resources to support decision making, people are more likely to make decisions in their best interest. There are a number of studies like this.
So that would increase their welfare, but not necessarily lift them permanently out of poverty.
Yeah, that's sort of an empirical question. We're not quite there yet,
Right.
But we do think that they're more likely to, enroll in school, to take health medication they themselves have asked for and have at home, if they're reminded to do so, for instance. And so the general implication is that it would be useful to move decisions out of periods when people are short on cognitive resources, or if you can't do that, to support those decisions through, I gave the example of the Tangier documentation, but there are a variety of things that can be done along those lines. For instance, in the case of conditional cash transfers, we don't think enough about timing.
Right.
The timing may matter. There's a nice study in Bogota in which a conditional cash transfer was partly deferred and paid in arrears to individuals right before the decision to matriculate into universities. That had I believe a 49%, that led to a 49% increase in matriculation rates. Sort of holding some money back to sort of signal to people that, now's an important time, you have some money, you can afford this, because they weren't necessarily saving that money by themselves.
Do we have a sense of the size of these effects? I mean, if it's welfare increasing to assist people by reducing the effects of their constrained cognitive resources in some way or another. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a relatively cheap thing to do, but B, it doesn't sound. I mean, I'm not sure that if I had a 10% reduction in my measured IQ, I'm not sure I believe in IQ tests, but whatever that's measuring, I'm not sure how big an effect that would have on my welfare. So I make worse choices about how I manage my day. But is fixing that, presumably only in part fixing that, actually going to increase my welfare by enough to make this a sensible intervention for us to worry about, or is this quite a marginal effect?
Yeah, well, the effects are substantial, but they're even more substantial when you think about the relatively low cost of the interventions. Changing the timing of a transfer costs very little.
Right.
Some of these, little text messages that remind people to take their medication, that costs very little.
Right.
Changing, when government communicates, it could sort of change a little letter,
Right.
And that, some of these examples show that including a sentence about how many other people are paying their taxes increases the likelihood that individuals will pay their taxes by a few percent. Well, it's not a huge effect, but it costs nothing to add a sentence to a letter.
So listeners who are interested in this should read Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, which is full of examples of this kind, of these kind of low cost but apparently quite effective.
Well, they should also read the WDR.
And they should read the WTR as well.
Which has a set of development examples.
Right. Okay, so these are relatively low cost, but you're not claiming that the effects on welfare are as large as, say, a vaccination program would be? Or you are?
Well, okay, so let me throw out some numbers at you. Okay, so in one study in Kenya, changing the timing of delivery of fertilizers was equivalent to a 50% increase, equivalent to a 50% subsidy.
Okay.
You know, if you delivered, you know, so that made an impact. In one experiment in Mysore in India, data entry clerks were observed to be who were paid piece rate for typing things correctly. You know, would sort of increase their piece rate right before holidays when they needed money. They were asked to, if they wanted to sign up for a commitment contract, where they would receive slightly lower wages if they failed to meet their own targets. This increased productivity by 6%, which was the equivalent of an 18% increase in wages. Right? So compared to paying people to work harder, or paying people to take up a program or to use technological input like fertilizer, it's pretty effective, you know, and those magnitudes are relatively large.
So in the foreword to the WDR, Jim Kim seems to suggest that the main relevance for development policy of all this is A, improving service delivery, and B, climate change, how we think about global norms and global agreements. Now, obviously he's your boss, so he is by definition right. But are those the two areas in which you see this having important implications? This is service delivery and getting to global agreements such as on climate change. Is that where we should look for progress from this?
Yeah, so one could, you know, think about sort of where we are now and where we might be,
Right.
you know, in some time in the future. Service delivery is a clear area where this is relevant because people, as we've been discussing, don't take advantage of opportunities available to them because they forget, they don't, you know, paying attention. Conditional cooperation is an important lever to use in getting to agreements of various sorts. You know, climate change is one. There's research on, you know, about conflict between, say, you know, people who are different sides of a war, and that's sort of it could potentially be useful there. That's, you know, those are areas where we have good evidence. This is important. There's also, you know, emerging areas. And say in the area of aspirations, which we haven't really talked about so much, you know, we think about this in terms of, you know, a mental model of yourself. You might think if you're low caste, this is my only place in life. But there are now interventions which suggest that interventions can be changed through messaging, emotional messaging, you know, through entertainment education, through media. People attribute the fertility decline in Brazil to soap operas. You know, in part. There's research in India that shows that, you know, exposure to modern cable TV was related to increasing women's autonomy and lower rates of gender-based violence. There's an extremely intriguing example from California in which young African-American students in 7th grade were asked to perform some self-affirmation exercises. And this result for about, you know, an hour, I think half hour early in 7th grade, and this resulted in higher grades a year and a half later. The thought being that most kids' grades decline in 8th grade, but if you're African American, you may have a self-stereotype, which you think, oh, of course this would happen to me. But this insulated people against this kind of stereotype. So that's another area. Another area which we haven't talked about yet is in early childhood development, right? Because some of these orientations and cognitive skills emerge at a very young age. And so there's an agenda related to helping parents who don't engage in cognitive stimulation, providing support. You know, there's good evidence from Jamaica that this really makes a difference to outcomes a good while later. Then there's a sort of very long-term agenda in which, you know, we know that, say, trust in government is very important for a variety of outcomes. We've been aware of this for some time. We don't quite know yet whether that's amenable to behavioral interventions, but maybe. You know, law-abidingness, trust, corruption, these all sort of have a social norms element and a cognitive element to them. And so we may, down the road, have a set of interventions in that area too. So while, you know, my president is certainly right,
obviously,
there's a medium-term and longer-term agenda here as well.
Right. Excellent. You're listening to Development Drums with me, Owen Barder, from the Centre for Global Development, and my guest today is Varun Gauri, and we're talking about this year's World Development Report, Mind, Society and Behaviour, of which Varun was the co-director. So we're coming now to the third and final section, which is looking at the relevance of this, as we were just beginning to get into, the relevance of this to development professionals and development organisations. Now, Jim Kim's forward to the WDR suggests that one reason why we should be thinking about this research is because it reminds us of the biases and harmful effects of heuristics that we ourselves apply as development professionals. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, that was a particularly fun part of the report to work on. All of us are subject to biases, right? All of us are subject to these cognitive limitations. All of us are subject to social norms, and we all carry around mental models of the world. And that, by no means, are development professionals excluded from this universal fact of human nature. To illustrate this, we did a survey of World Bank staff. We were interested in a couple particular biases. The one which is perhaps most striking was one called confirmation bias. This is the tendency to discount information that is contrary to our priors and overvalue information that conforms to those priors. Dan Kahan of Yale Law School, with Don Brayman and others, have done some work on what they call cultural cognition, which is a version of confirmation bias. And we tweaked their experiment and applied it to World Bank staff. We sent around, in this survey, online survey, information in a 2x2 table about skin cream and minimum wages. The table was identical in the two different framings. In one case, it was about whether skin cream A or skin cream B is more likely to eliminate a rash. In another framing, it was about whether the minimum wage is likely to raise or lower poverty rates, which is a contested issue in economics, of course. World Bank staff were more likely, about 20% more likely to get the answer right in the skin cream framing than in the minimum wage framing. And you might say, well, that's surprising because they're experts in this area. But it didn't happen despite the fact that they're experts. It happened because they're experts, right? They thought they knew the answer, then didn't really do the math. We also asked World Bank staff about their views on wage equality. And found that the errors that people have made were systematically related to their political priors. So there's evidence of confirmation bias among World Bank staff. We replicated the survey with a sample in DFID, almost identical results there. So bank staff have this tendency to bring their mental models to information that they collect.
As does everybody. I mean, we're not having a go at bank and DFID staff.
Development professionals more generally, like all experts, themselves are subject to biases.
So well-run organizations need to deal with that, right? They need to acknowledge that that's happening and adjust their behavior in some way to cope with that. What is it that organizations like the bank or DFID should do, given your finding of these, in this case, confirmation bias?
Yeah. So one thought, or a couple thoughts. One is that if experts themselves use system one and quickly come to a jump to a conclusion, we need to slow them down and get them to think more analytically and deliberatively, which means allowing space for it, which means more rigorous testing, evaluation of projects. It also so that's one thought, and one of our
just on that, you had this wonderful example of the bat and the ball that together cost $1.10.
Yeah.
And the question, our listeners can work this out in their heads, if the bat costs 10 cents more than the ball, how much?
$1 more.
$1 more. What did I say? 10 cents.
Yeah.
The bat costs $1 more than the ball. What does the ball cost, and what does the bat cost?
That's right.
And your instinct is to say, well, obviously the bat costs $1 and the ball costs 10 cents, and it's.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's the incorrect answer.
That's the incorrect answer. Obviously, it's $1.05 and 5 cents, because that adds up to $1.10. But most people get this wrong, in studies.
No, I did, as I read it. But
statistics students at top universities get this wrong.
Right.
There's a lot of examples of things like this.
Right. So you need to slow people down by doing what?
By requiring careful review of evidence in a variety of ways. In the context of whether projects are working or not, more evidence, more evaluation, including randomized evaluation, is useful. More multi-arm treatments are useful to sort of help people figure out what works. If you want to figure out if the minimum wage lowers or raises poverty rates, actually test it. Don't have these assumptions. That's one general recommendation, sort of rely more on analytic thinking and evidence. The second is to harness our natural tendency to be advocates. There's a view that we are natural-born lawyers, not natural-born scientists. And so we want to sort of, prove something. And that's not the same thing as getting at the truth. And so, in a lot of organizations, you have something called red teaming. Right. Like the military does this in war games. And this sort of harnesses the fact that people really want to advocate from one point of view. And you have two teams sort of taking a point of view, and the decision maker hears the best arguments. Development organizations could also do a better job with peer review. I think we try and get at this problem of slower thinking with peer review, but it tends not to be anonymous. It tends to be we find our friends, our colleagues who we have worked with in the past to sort of review our work. So that's a set of things that could be done. Another bias, that development professionals are subject to, and experts generally are subject to, is the thought is that we may have different and incorrect models of how poor individuals think and behave. So we asked World Bank staff to predict how poor individuals in Nairobi and Lima and Jakarta would answer a set of questions. One of them was about whether they feel in control of their own lives. Another was whether they feel helpless. Another was whether vaccines are risky because they can cause sterilization. World Bank staff estimated that about 42% of poor individuals in Nairobi would agree with the statement that vaccines are risky because they can cause sterilization. In fact, it was just 11%. Right. So we don't necessarily, we have good measures of poverty, but not necessarily of mindsets. Right. And so, and that if we believe mindsets are important, then we should actually measure them in our work and begin to become aware of how people think and choose. So an interesting part of the report to me, because I'm very interested in the notion of adaptation and evolution of project management, was the idea that part of the answer to this might be more adaptive project management, less planning at the beginning, less of the kind of log frame or theory of change approach, and more trying stuff, seeing what works, and letting the project evolve. Yeah. Is that a more promising avenue than trying to have the individuals in the World Bank or in DFID or in other organizations overcome their cognitive biases? Is it better to try and take their cognitive biases out of the equation as best we can? Tell me how that's going in the World Bank and what can be done there. Yeah. Yeah, I can't say which is more promising. I think you'll find cognitive scientists who would say to you that it's very hard to de-bias people on an individual level. Right. And maybe we need to sort of harness groups, to sort of reinforce. When it becomes part of a group standard routine, you sort of reinforce the contrary action for individuals. We are interested, we do make the case in the report that we need more adaptive interventions and more adaptive design. We need to sort of think about mindsets and cognitive limitations in designing projects and sort of really carefully diagnose what our problem is, and think about the behavior at stake. So it's not just, people don't go to school, but, they're scared to go to school because of the threat of violence, and sort of really get at what's underneath it. But I wondered whether we just, by going for the adaptive version, we don't just shift the problem to our biases when we make the adaptation. So something isn't working and we're trying to figure out why it's not working, to adapt the intervention to make it work better. And if we're bringing all our biases to the table in understanding what's working and what isn't working, and in making choices about how the
how the program adapts and evolves, then it seems to me we're still constrained by our biases, isn't it?
It could be, but evidence helps. I mean,
Right.
there's a to give you an example, there's a nice set of experiments on water that the Poverty Action Lab conducted, and there were, 3 different treatments, 3 versions of intervention, which were used to get at getting people to consume cleaner water. In one, ground springs were protected, with concrete and pipes. In another, chlorine was delivered to the home so that individuals would dechlorinate at home. In the third, a chlorine dispenser was located right next to the well itself. Now, ex ante, you don't really know which of those is going to be better. You probably, given you may have a strong prior,
Right.
It turned out that what worked was the dispenser right next to the source. Some of the problems with the improved well is that individuals would then collect the clean water in a container which was itself contaminated, or mix it with contaminated water at home. A problem with the home delivery of chlorine is that people would forget to then keep asking for the deliveries. Whereas when the dispenser was right near the source, it was a reminder to people to dechlorinate right when they got there. So, one of the challenges of this area is that we don't have a simple theory.
Right.
In standard economics, you raise prices, people want less, and they supply more. It's mostly true and
Right.
mostly powerful. We don't know what is, what if we make things more salient, what's going to happen? What does it even mean to make something 10% more salient? How do you measure that? And so we need to be relentlessly empirical as a result.
But if we are ourselves subject to these biases and we get data that doesn't fit our mental model, as we've just spent the first part of the podcast talking about, we don't in fact adjust our mental model. We stick with our mental model long after its useful time. So, as you say, evidence helps, but it doesn't actually overwhelm our biases very often.
Well, there's a set of there's a set of political economy considerations about evaluation. Confronted with this very clear data, I think most experts, development professionals would agree that, okay, we should use the one that's most cost effective. And so we should, in this instance, put the chlorine dispenser next to the source, for people in this situation anyway, in this time and place. But often we don't have the time or the resources to conduct these evaluations or to then assimilate what they mean. People have written about the fact, the political economy reasons why organizations don't devote enough time to evaluation. Sometimes people don't want to know the truth, Other times there's sort of a lending imperative, or there's sort of a publicity imperative of showing success, and these things can get in the way.
So listeners who want to know more about that should read CGD's report on the evaluation gap, which both looks at and tries to explain why there's not enough rigorous impact evaluation.
Absolutely.
I want to move on to this question of the role of external actors, development professionals, external aid agencies, in nudging, and there's been a lot of controversy, some controversy within our own countries about the role of government in what Cass Sunstein called libertarian paternalism. There's kind of this notion of benign paternalism, that changing the order, putting the salads at the front of the lunch queue rather than at the end of the lunch queue, is still giving people a choice. It's still libertarian, but it's nudging people to do things that are good for them. And it seems to me there isn't a consensus about the extent to which we want governments to do that for us. Still less, I imagine, is there a consensus about the extent to which World Bank staff and DFID staff should be nudging people in the developing world to do what we consider to be good for them. So can you say something about whether, to what extent you think it's clear that there is a role for external actors in this benign paternalism?
You're right to say that there isn't a consensus yet, right? And whatever we think of this on philosophical grounds or welfare grounds, we need to be aware that people disagree on the value and validity of external actors nudging, shaping the choice architecture. to guide decisions in a certain way. Given that there's disagreement, I think we need to be very clear about disclosing what we're doing and having a public discussion about what's going on. And we also need to base these decisions on good evidence. So that's sort of the sort of process that I think we would be supportive of. Not hiding it, having a public discussion, and recognizing that there's disagreement, and trying to, base decisions on solid evidence.
The hard thing about this is that you're going beyond people's revealed preference and postulating that their revealed preference is not a good indicator of, in some sense, their underlying preference, that what they would choose if their cognitive resources weren't so constrained, or if they had more information, or they were to step outside their mental models for a while. And that's hard to have good evidence. It always sounds dangerous to me when we get into the business of false consciousness, of thinking that what people actually choose, given a free choice, right, is in our view not what they would really choose if in a different situation, and we're going to nudge them to something else. That's quite a hard thing for us to have evidence about, isn't it?
Well, I guess I would disagree with that a little bit, in the sense that a good chunk of what we're talking about here are helping people obtain their already expressed goals. If you send someone a text reminder to take their HIV/AIDS medication weekly, it may bump up compliance with the treatment regimen from 40% to 53%, right? The person has already got the medicine, they're just forgetting to take it.
Right.
If someone tells you they want to save money and they just sort of don't necessarily, save a reminder, it's sort of helping them along in something they've already decided they want to do. Similarly, commitment mechanisms in which people sign up to suffer a penalty if they don't save or don't eat healthy are optional. People don't have to sign up for them, but they do, and when they do, they then are helping themselves achieve their goals. So a good chunk of what we're talking about is, in fact, consistent with revealed preference. Another point is that there may be situations where things are somewhat more ambiguous, but there's no, as Sunstein and Thaler, right, there's no neutral here sometimes, right? There's no, if you're communicating with people, or if you're setting up a program in which you're signing up for a water hookup or a health program, you can make it complicated or easy, right? Why not make it easy to sign up? If you're setting up a default option, default options for savings are well known. You have to either say you automatically enroll in retirement savings, or you don't, or you automatically have 10% of your paycheck saved or 2% of your paycheck saved. Someone has to set that, and so given that there's no way of not nudging, you might as well do things in ways that are consistent with people's own interests, the libertarian paternalist would say, but then also allow people to then opt out if they in fact don't want to save 11% towards savings. So that's another chunk of things we're talking about.
But there's something uncomfortably unaccountable about technocrats from the World Bank, and I'm not having a go at the World Bank or DFID or USAID or anybody else from the outside, being influential in setting the defaults, right? I mean, isn't setting the defaults part of what a community should do for itself?
Yeah.
Whether it's pension opt-outs or all the things we're talking about.
Yeah.
There's something uncomfortable about the idea of unaccountable outsiders doing this, isn't there?
Well, it's sort of a loaded question, I think. I mean, we have to be careful not to reify community, right? I mean, it's not as if there are no conflicts of interest within a community. And if someone's setting the defaults in a community, it's not obvious they're going to choose the one that's welfare maximizing. They might do it, to benefit certain parties and not others. And of course, it's important to work with governments, with civil society organizations, and with communities also to work out what makes sense. You can't come at this without evidence, and one of the crucial pieces of evidence is what people they themselves say they want. And then just the final point.
But we come to, as you said yourself, we come to this with our biases too. So
Sure.
The danger is that we're setting the nudges and setting the defaults, according to you're absolutely right. Within a community, there are constraints and biases and interests, as there are in our communities.
Yeah. So here's where we come down in the report, which is that, it's sort of a Amartya Sen capabilities view of freedom and human rights, which is that we should be using this to support basic, widely agreed upon human capabilities. We want people to be healthier. We want people to go to school. We want people not to be poor, right? In some sense, the World Bank's mission to end poverty is a paternalistic mission, right? You can't get around that. Development is a paternalistic project. If you disagree with it, well, then let's have a different conversation. But if you buy into it, then, on some of these core questions, I think we can say there's wide agreement, and we shouldn't feel shy about doing it. It's also the case that it's not as if choices are unconstrained absent outside of the government coming in. There's a nice example in the report about in Tanzania, people decided to get people to sign up for community health insurance at the time they had money, rather than when do you have a campaign to get people to sign up? Why not do it when they have some cash, after harvest? And you might think, well, that's sort of taking advantage of them. But if you hadn't been asking them to sign up for community health insurance, other vendors would have been selling their wares to these people with advertising, with influencing, taking advantage of it. So it's not as if the World Bank and governments and DFID and everyone else steps back, there's going to be free sovereign individuals making totally uninfluenced choices. There's the private sector. There's lots of other people involved, and why not do it for the public good?
So I'm coming to the final question, which is about the place of this in broader development policy. Yeah. There was a blog, I think, by Jeffrey Hammer on one of the World Bank blogs. Incidentally, the World Bank blogs, if people are not reading them, are just a terrific model of how organizations should communicate and think publicly. And so he said, I imagine that you were thought it a fairly disobliging blog post, which said that he'd been at an IGC, an International Growth Centre conference, where the Chief Minister of Punjab had criticised economists for offering these small-scale tweaks of the kind that we're talking about, although you've made the case that they're bigger than that makes them sound. When what he really needs is help with making big decisions and the big financial resources. How much should I be spending on education? Should we be investing in a dam or infrastructure? These are. And do you feel as if through this report the World Bank is drifting away from addressing what Lance Pritchett here at the Centre would call the big development questions, the things that we ought to be engaged in favour of, I hesitate to call them second-order things, but things that look that are more to do with improving people's welfare in whatever situation they're in, and less to do with driving big social economic change in developing countries. I mean, is there a sense in which this is a sideshow? Yeah,
that we certainly often get a question like that, and a couple of points. First, many of these interventions are relatively low cost. We've discussed this. Tweaking a letter, sending a reminder, setting up a commitment device, showing a movie, self-affirmation exercises.
Right.
So why not do this? Right? As well as everything else, right? They're not necessarily rivals. We could sort of say, well, we need to figure out a successful growth strategy for a country. We need to figure out how to make governance work, which I believe in, but good luck with that. While we're working on all that, why don't we go ahead and make our current projects and programs more effective for relatively low cost, right? That strikes me as relatively uncontroversial. Mm-hmm. It's not displacing the Chief Minister of Punjab's questions, but saying, look, let's work on that, but also do this. The second point is that, as I said earlier, it may be the case that this agenda provides important insights for the Chief Minister's question. We're not quite there yet, but we know we may. And when this was posed to us, Ravi Kanbor, when we presented the report once, said, well, look, tell me why China is China, right? That's the big question. It's not really about this kind of stuff. And, it's a fair point. At the same time, when China moved towards parts of private property, it didn't do so radically. It sort of was cognizant of social realities, and privatized in kin groups, and in small collectives. And was, some of the moves there were, obviously the report wasn't written, behavioral economics wasn't around, but, the idea of social relationships has been around for a long time. And so it may be the case that large-scale growth strategies themselves might be informed by this. Things like law-abidingness and trust in government may be informed by this as well. So I think that the large questions also may eventually benefit from this research agenda.
You've been listening to Development Drums with me, Owen Barder, from the Centre for Global Development, and my guest today has been Varun Gauri, the co-director of this year's World Development Report, Mind, Society and Behaviour. And if it isn't obvious from the conversation, please do go and read this. It's available online and at a small number of good bookshops. Varun, thank you very much for coming on Development Drums.
Thanks, Owen. I enjoyed it.